From the beginning. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your perseverance. I'm going to give you a brief history of reform as a political force. As I said earlier, the setting that we're in is apt because County Durham Council has, in May of this year, gone over to reform for the first time in its history, and it's indicative of the problems that the ruling class currently has politically. The ruling class has many shop fronts for electoral politics, and you're encouraged by the ruling class to mainly use the Tories, and then when the Tories become untenable, then you can use Labour. And now the wheels have fallen off of them as well within 12 months of being elected to office. There's other alternatives now available to you, including reform. But it's worth looking at the history of reform. Reform, its spiritual ancestor is, of course, UKIP. And UKIP was formed as the Anti-Federalist League in 1993 by a sort of petty bourgeois libertarian academic by the name of Alan Sked. Alan Sked ran that party for about 4 years and then was ousted in a coup. In fact, he resigned and wrote a rather bitter letter saying that the party was dragged to the far right and was riddled with factionalism. And it's easy to assume that after Sked was outed, Farage rose to prominence, but he didn't. It took about 9 years after Sked being ousted for Farage to rise to the helm of the party. In the intervening period, the party had mixed success electorally at local, general and European elections, but Farage managed to endear himself to working class people in his mannerisms, including enjoying a pint and a fag sometimes and speaking to people in very down-to-earth language. Tried to cast himself as an everyday man. Of course he isn't. He's been to schools that we'd never get a chance to get into. But despite that, he has found himself a base amongst the working class. But in reality, despite claims from some quarters that he's far right, he's not actually far right. He's actually a Thatcherite. He's an old 1980s style Thatcherite. He's not actually a million miles away from people who used to pepper the backbenches of the Tories all through the 80s. And I think of people, I don't know if you are old enough to remember, people like Teddy Taylor and Rhodes Boyson are two people that speak to mind as old school Thatcherites. I always remember Rhodes Boyson because he had enormous sideburns that always made him stand out from a crowd. But he talks like an 80s era Thatcherite as well. He talks about reducing immigration, cutting taxes, he denies climate change and bringing back grammar schools and things like that. So UKIP rose to essentially mainstream status in 2014 when it won 163 council seats, and in the same year was the single biggest British party in the European elections. And in fact, what I'm going to do now is, as it was 2014, I'm going to read a quote to you and I want you to guess who said this. So, you ready? This EU empire, ever seeking to expand, stated its territorial claim on the Ukraine some years ago. Just to make that worse, of course, some NATO members said that they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We, the European Union, directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the president Yanukovych, and that led, of course, in turn to Vladimir Putin reacting. And the moral of the story is, if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts. Today we are rushing through an association agreement at undue speed with the Ukraine, and as we speak there are NATO soldiers engaged in military exercises in Ukraine. Have we taken leave of our senses? Do we actually want to have a war with Putin? Because if we do, then we are certainly going about it in the right way. Perhaps we ought to recognise that the West now faces the biggest threat and crisis to our way of life that we have seen for over 70 years. Ranjeet, you have your hand up. Anyone else? Did anyone take a guess as to who said that? It would be Nigel Farage, and he said it in the European Parliament in September of 2014, and that's worth remembering because we're obviously going to analyse his stance on Ukraine 11 years hence after that.
I agree with him.
Well, I mean, let's be honest, that conceivably is a speech you would have expected to hear at any trade union annual general meeting over the Ukraine crisis. At least until the bureaucrats in the trade union movement got involved and decided to go fall behind the NATO war in Ukraine. But the Tories were put on the back foot by UKIP's rise. And the Tories have always had a very uneasy alliance. There's always been an uneasy alliance between its Eurosceptic and Europhile halves. And it could be argued that it's only by dint of the electoral system that these two halves stay together. Because essentially they are servants of the ruling class, and they're prepared to put some differences aside in order to serve those interests. But if, for instance, we had a change of voting system, it's conceivable, much like the Labour Party, that it would split into two. So during this period, around about the 2014 mark, a chap called Douglas Carswell, who was a Tory MP in Clacton-on-Sea, which ironically is now Nigel Farage's seat, he defected to UKIP from the Conservatives. And then in the 2015 general election, 3.8 million people voted for UKIP, but they didn't get any seats. Farage, running for MP in South Thanet in Kent, said that he'd resign if he didn't win the seat, and he didn't. So he tendered his resignation, and then 3 days later the NEC said, no, you're not resigning, I'm afraid you're still in charge. And the Tories were then dragged by forces within their own party, and under the threat of these mass defections to UKIP, to call a referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. And in 2016, of course, we got Brexit. So UKIP's reason to exist had largely been negated. Brexit had been voted for, wasn't delivered, but it was voted for. And so the party started to fall apart, and people went in all kinds of different directions. So Nigel Farage resigned as leader. Mr. Carswell resigned from the party and stood as an independent. And in 2017, UKIP lost all 145 council seats it was defending. So, as the ruling class bumbled their way through trying to deliver Brexit, a new party came along to try and push them towards the appropriate door, and that was originally the Brexit Party, which was formed in 2018 by a chap called Richard Tice and Nigel Farage. It's actually a private company, the Brexit Party, now reformed, and they had policies including pushing for a hard Brexit, pushing the government into actually carrying out a Brexit and not a Brexit in name only, and they were instrumental in their own way in forcing the government to actually come up with something that resembled a Brexit deal. Not quite the deal we would have liked to have seen, but one all the same. But where did Reform go after that? Well, of course, they were instrumental in the 2024 general election. They helped destroy the Tories, because although they didn't win many seats, they only actually totalled 5. They came second in so many constituencies that they totally broke the Tory vote, which meant that Labour, with a majority, it has to be said, is a mile wide but an inch deep, became the party of government. Now, where are Reform now? There are some people, and I'm minded to be persuaded by the term that Reform are looking like they could form a majority at the next general election. I think we have to be prepared for that, because the Tories are currently completely untenable, and as I said earlier on, the Labour Party have managed to, what precious little goodwill they had, they've blown inside 12 months. So how do we know that the ruling class are looking at Reform as a sizeable or an alternative to the Tories and the Labour Party? We'll look at some of the actions of Nigel Farage. I just read out a speech that he gave in the European Parliament, where he warned the European Parliament against imperialist action in Ukraine, and he's now foursquare in favour of the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. Farage has also called for the proscription of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Not that I think they're particularly active in this country, but he's called for it anyway. He's done a volte-face on Ukraine, as I said. And what must we guard against, though? Of course, if we are to accept that Reform are a tenable alternative for the ruling class, so Labour and the Tories, what will the left do? The left will do what they will always do: must vote Labour to defeat fascism. That's what they will always say. They will always say we must vote Labour to defeat fascism. But of course, if we were to vote Labour, we would end up with in no better a place, frankly, than if Reform were to form a government. We would have the same rampant austerity, we'd have the same rampant imperialism, we would have the same attacks on the working class here and abroad as we would have with any other party of any other colour. So I'm gonna close it there. That's my potted version of the rise of reform. Hope you enjoyed it, and open to any questions or comments. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you, Jason. That was a really useful overview of where these forces have come from. I just wanted to add a point before I open it up to the floor, which is when we look at the marketing campaign that is propelling the rise of reform, it's very clear that a large section of bourgeoisie is backing Nigel Farage. Simultaneously, they are trying to present him to the poor, disaffected, angry section of the working class as a rebel, as an outsider, as a disruptor. But they constantly present him to us as that. The real rebels, outsiders and disruptors are never presented to you. They don't. Look at our party. There's a blanket ban on mentioning our name in the mainstream media. We would never get invited on the telly to debate Nigel Farage or anybody else. Right? This is astroturfing. This is red carpeting of a curated rebellion. So whether they are preparing the ground for a reform majority or whether there's going to be a reform Tory merger, what's clear is the ruling class are preparing to ditch Labour at the next election. And I would like to add one final point how you can see that is because Jeremy Corbyn, who refused to start a new party before the last election when it would have disrupted the Labour vote, is now ready to do it. And that tells me that the ruling class wants the Labour vote split, thinks it's going to be useful, just like in the last election it was useful to split the Tory vote and make sure they were definitely annihilated, and Labour, despite being hugely unpopular, Labour got a huge majority. We have to remember how well that was massaged. 18% of British adults voted Labour in that election, yet because of abstentions and because of the way the vote was split in various other ways, they have a huge majority in Parliament. And I think the ruling class is now looking to make sure that while they ditch Labour, who become hugely unpopular, having done a few things they were brought in to do, the working class are very angry with Labour. They get ready to ditch them, but they want a secure, stable next government after that. And it's clear that reform is an important part of that strategy. We don't know yet whether it will be reform majority or a reform Tory merger or something along those lines. But you can see the signs that that's the direction they're pushing us in. And then finally, I just want to make the point that there's another reason why reform is so useful and important, and that is because as conditions of life get so much worse for British workers, as we are driving into more and more and more war and militarisation and upping the war budget whilst destroying all the public services and people's wages, pay and conditions, it's extremely important that we have a huge campaign of scapegoating of other workers to distract us, distract our attention, confuse us about the cause of our problems, turn our anger against ourselves instead of against the system. And this is a big, very important part of reform's job. It's to endlessly promote the narrative that says the reason workers are poor is not capitalism, it's not imperialism, it's other workers. And that's the job. That job has become very important for the ruling class because so many workers are angry. And they need to misdirect our anger and stop us unifying or they're in trouble. So I'm going to open up to the floor now. Any questions, any comments, please feel free.
I believe one of their mottos is "Stop the Boats." It's part of their campaign in the local elections. I don't know how to put it as well as you may be able to. Part of that "Stop the Immigrants" was apart from financially needed immigrants. As I say, I can't put it as well as you may be able to, but can you comment on that, please?
Well, I think it's certainly true that the vast majority of people who come to this country to live and work as immigrants don't come on boats, they come in aeroplanes. But all this does, it just feeds into the narrative. When I was out sending the free papers out earlier on, I got to chatting with a chap from Reform, And it didn't take him long to blame the decay of his local town on the rise of immigration. And it's what he's done is what a lot of people have done, which is to identify a problem and then misidentify the reason for that problem. But this is because reform are part of the apparatus of the ruling class, feeding a narrative into the working class that all their problems are caused by immigration. We know that that's not true. We know that the ruling class, if we don't replace ourselves with workers, they will get workers from somewhere else, and they don't really care where they come from. They also obviously engage in rapacious wars that cause destitution and suffering to people in all corners of the world, and they find themselves forced to do what people, let's be blunt, in this country would never have to do, which is to pack their bags and move somewhere new, just to have a decent life. So, unfortunately, Reform are just playing into the ruling class narrative, which is used very effectively as a tool to split working class people against each other.
It's an easy game, it's a simple game, and we've got it.
Thank you, Jason. Did anyone else want to make a comment or contribution or question relating to reform?
Hello. There's various people saying that if we don't stop reform, we'll get fascism. Where do you think the fascism will actually come from?
Any old one gets any prize on the stall.
You got to
Take
answer?
the stall, top to bottom, left to
Give
right.
you a go.
Who's going to be on the
Fascism comes when the imperialist ruling class is in crisis because of the rise of a militant working class. Fascism is the brute, forceful, open, terroristic dictatorship over the workers as they are rising in rebellion and organising themselves in a meaningful way which threatens the foundations of the state. And any party can be the vehicle for fascism if they are a servant of the ruling class, and that's the moment when the ruling class needs to enact fascism. It doesn't require a uniform of a certain type. It doesn't require a particular flavour of bourgeois politics. It's more likely when it comes to ideologically manipulating sections of the population to join in with the fascistic agenda of the ruling class, that the kind of forces of the far right who are active now will be given injections of cash to become more active and mobilise sections of disaffected workers and petty bourgeois into ranks of militia. Because one of the features of a fascistic government is that it works hand in hand with informal armed forces that are used to terrorise the working class. We don't have that in this country yet, because the working class is not in need of fascistic repression. We're repressing ourselves and failing to organise ourselves in a meaningful way to create the kind of problems we're talking about. We won't stop fascism at the ballot box. Fascism will come because we start to defend ourselves, and we will have to defend ourselves even more. But the real solution to fascism is us working hard to disabuse angry workers of the prejudices, the lies that they've absorbed, the misdirection that they are being given, and help them realise they're being tricked against their better interests into becoming dupes and tools of their class enemies. And that's our job. That's the role we have to be playing now, and as much as, more and more as time goes by and the crisis gets worse.
We're looking for the next one. All big prices, they're just one win. You
Can I
got to be
just
on number, you
seem to comment on how it could be any party. In fact, both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, just as much as Reform, are blaming the problems of the working class on immigrants. All of them say everybody agrees with it, that there's no dissent. And the second point to note is that we've now had an organisation banned as being terrorist for taking an action against Britain's war crimes in Gaza. In fact, that organisation is fulfilling human responsibility. But basically, terrorist measures have been used against it. So they would be thrown into prison. You'd expect anyway that there was always a right to, but now anybody who sends them a fiver, anyone who says, oh, that was rather good, can end up in prison for 14 years as well. So the reign of terror is already beginning, and there's a sense in which if they get away with it, they'll be encouraged to start banning even more organisations.
100% comrade, and I just want to add to that, it's a very important point that you made, that we are seeing, the ruling class is aware that mass working class rebellion is on the way, and they are preparing for it, and what we see is every single party is assisting them to make those preparations. So the Labour Party, as much as the Tory Party and the Liberal Democrat Party, and if they were in power, the Green Party, they're all ready to do the same job. The SNP in Scotland, Plaid Cymru in Wales, they're all ready to encourage in the spread of anti-immigrant lies, to enforce draconian anti-immigrant policy, to enact anti-terror so-called legislation, which is essentially fascistic in nature. It's fascistic targeting of, at the moment, small sections of the beginning to be rebellious and active working class. But that's ready to expand to much more of the working class, and as the comrade rightly said, if we accept it, they will do more of it. And we will get fascism by inches and be surprised to turn one day and find out that as we're trying to rebel, that the full mechanism of a fascistic state machine is already in place, and we've been letting it come, and we've been tricking ourselves by saying, but as long as we don't vote for reform, if we keep voting Labour, things are going to be all right. But it's a Labour government right now that is enacting the very legislation and trying to set up the legal framework so that terrorising those who stand up, even though their number is relatively small at the moment, becomes normal. And then as the numbers grow, a lot of working class people will feel that it's normal to terrorise people who rebel against the crimes against us at home and the crimes being perpetrated by our rulers abroad. Right. So we're going to move on from the topic of the rise of reform, because I have another comrade here, Comrade Ranjeet, our General Secretary and member of our Central Committee, who's going to talk to us about, very well connected to what we were just saying, the Labour Party and repression. Thank you, Ranjeet.
So, wow, it's that. Thank you, comrades. Lovely to be here, lovely to see you today. We're just talking about Labour Party being the agent of repression and who will bring fascism. It's important to say fascism won't come to this country until the working people learn to stand up for themselves. And I'm really sorry to say, walking around the gala today, compared to 20 years ago when I used to come here, there are few signs of the working people standing up for themselves. The Durham Gala came out of some of the finest traditions of the most militant sections of the British working class, of organised labour, of the miners' struggle. The miners, if you think of the black-leg miner as a story of the way in which workers learnt to struggle together for their interests against capital, of their hatred of those who would betray that struggle, there goes the black-leg miner. Precisely because they knew that solidarity to stand together against the interests of capital was necessary to preserve them and their interests and their families. And that's something we need to reclaim. We can see the effect of deindustrialization, of the massive assault on the miners in 1984, have had upon organised labour. When there was a strong miners' union, when there was a strong miners' industry, there was no such thing as a 0 hours contract in our country. We wouldn't have stood for it. What do you mean a 0 hours contract? You mean you're going to employ me but give me no work? You can employ me, but I have to stand by the telephone my whole life. And if I don't respond to your call, then you'll sack me. But I'll get 3 hours of work, or 5 hours of work, or 11 hours of work, so little work that when I get my money, I actually can't afford to live on it. So I have to still live with my parents and beg. So I'm actually homeless, sofa surfing in my parents' house, allegedly employed, not officially unemployed, because I've got a 0 hours contract. And there are millions, there are 4 million people on 0 hours contracts, and we've lost our minds. I used to work, I'm a surgeon, I worked in the NHS, I do work in the NHS. I worked in Yorkshire, and I used to find that the generation of people I was treating, I'm a vascular surgeon with arterial disease, they were proud people. They worked in the mines, they worked in the steel industry, they worked in, in machining, in mechanics. But they had industrial diseases and arterial disease, but they were proud. They had lived a good life, they had their own house, they had their own community, they had had holidays, they had a certain level of existence, and they had identity as working class men and women. Their children, when I went into the miners' village that no longer had mines and no longer had steel, no longer had mills and no longer had industry, were broken. They were overwhelmingly obese and out of shape because they had the diet as if they were going to the mines, but they don't bloody work. Yeah? No fault of their own, that was their culture. They had heroin in the villages and PlayStation in the villages, but no meaningful employment and no meaningful connection to their neighbour. They fought with themselves. A broken generation. That generation hasn't come from nowhere. It's come from the export of capital. It didn't come from immigration. It wasn't immigrants who took the miners' jobs. It was Thatcher as a representative of the neoliberal imperial class who said, we could pay these miners this much money, but it'd be far more money to be made if we instead use child miners in Colombia and import coal for our coal stations from there, whilst destroying the miners in order to liberalise the workforce so that their children and their children's children will be on 0 hours contract. We can pay them virtually nothing and maximise our profit. You can applaud that. It's not that it's a good idea. It's that why are we not told this by people who are campaigning for a working class vote? Why do they not say we can have jobs that are meaningful, we can have communities that are meaningful, we can have a lifestyle that's meaningful based on our own labour and solidarity? That our enemy are not other workers, because that's what ultimately immigrants are. My father's Indian. I was born here, born in Hemel Hempstead, in a little place that used to be the headquarters of the National Front when I grew up. So I'm familiar with anti-immigrant rhetoric, I'm familiar with what the workers are told. But the fact that they all thought they could buy their own home when I was a child, Thatcher gave us the right to buy our own homes. Amazing, we've all become homeowners. Aren't you privileged that you're a homeowner? Forget that home is just like the basic necessity of life without which you can't live. What's been the result of selling all the millions of council houses were sold to people who suddenly thought they'd changed from being a worker into being middle class? And what's the result? The house prices went up and up and up. Maybe a couple of people made a bit of money by selling their homes. And what happened to their children and their children's children, their generation rent? They can't afford a mortgage even, let alone to buy a house. House prices over the last 15 years have doubled. And what's happened to your wages? They're the same. And the monetary value of your wages has gone down. So working people in our country are being crushed. That's directly linked to the fact that the organised jobs were exported, capital was exported, jobs were exported, our communities were crushed, and we're given a certain kind of lifestyle with a certain amount of handout. They even talk about something called universal basic income. You might as well call it universal basic bribery. It's like, a little bit of beggary, universal basic beggary. You give everyone a little begging, just enough to live as long as you're good, but you don't actually have productive work, you don't have power. And who owns all the land in this country? Overwhelmingly. If you take up everyone's home who has a home, forget the 5, 6, 7 million homeless, everyone's home, if you add it up and you see what it is, it's less than 5% of the total land surface area of Britain. So who owns the 95% of the land? The same people who sit in the city of London and own everything else. They own the capital, they own the land, they're the ones who control the jobs, they control our political system. And they are the ones who decide. They will call a Labour leader and decide in the City of London whether that Labour leader has what it takes to become our next Prime Minister. And Corbyn, inoffensive as he is, he didn't offer anything more than a bit of free internet and a bit less student fees. But that was unacceptable to the barons of finance capital at this time. So they said no, and they sabotaged him, and they used the Labour Party apparatus to do it. We have walked around today with this free sheet that we've given out, like a mini paper, which we designed, and it says quite provocatively but quite sincerely, this quite sincere, it's not a throwaway comment, that Labour is the enemy of the working class. And we decided that we were going to have something equivalent to this, point out to people at this great Labour festival, where in fact the Durham Miners Committee wrote to us and asked us not to bring a banner with a picture of any communist leaders on it because it was against their ethos. But this is a Labour festival, and yet the Labour festival can let anyone come. If I want to come and sell coffee or hot dogs or slushies, if I want to pump you full of sugar and unhealth, that's okay.
But if I want to encourage you to think that there might be a different world that's possible, like the ragged trousered philanthropist, that you stop making palaces for the wealthy and in fact take back the very wealth that your Labour's created, I'm unwelcome here. And we have to ask ourselves why that is. And I put to you that it's because it's connected so intimately with the Labour Party, and the Labour Party has become an integral part of the apparatus of our enemy class. So that it's the Labour Party themselves who encourage repression. We decided on this kind of general theme of talk long before what we saw last weekend. Did anyone turn on the telly or look at the papers last weekend? You'll be aware there's a genocide going on in Gaza, and our Labour Party is running it. And there are mass demonstrations on our street who think it's wrong to participate in a genocide. And that in fact that genocide is linked to loot in the Middle East, which, you know what, displaces millions of Syrians, millions of Iraqis, millions of others. And where do they come? They get spread out principally locally, but many of them come here. Many people in our country think it's very wrong, the crimes that are being committed in our name, and they protest against them. And there's a group called Palestine Action, you may now have heard of them if you hadn't before, who have been made illegal under the provisions of the Terrorism Act. The provisions of the Terrorism Act. So if you peacefully protest by direct action and paint a plane red, you're a terrorist. But if you take that plane, lease it to a company who lease it to Israel to drop bombs on Palestinians, civilization centers, hospitals, schools, churches, mosques, UN aid facilities, points of distribution of aid, and commit a mass murder, and we don't know even the numbers, because, you know, we reached 100,000 many months ago, and we've like stopped counting. But different reports leak out, which probably put the figure at 300,000, 400,000 people who have been killed by the Israeli so-called Israeli offense forces, the Israeli army. The Israeli army are foot soldiers of our government, and the Labour Party is very much connected to them. If you open the pages of our free sheet, you'll see a speech by David Lammy saying we still want very good relations with the Israelis based on our shared values. What is that shared value of the Labour Party Foreign Secretary David Lammy and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu? They're seen so frequently hugging each other. Their common value is genocide in order to loot the peoples of the Middle East and crush the workers of Britain. And it's precisely for that reason that we have to recognize that Labour, far from being our friend, far from being the vehicle of socialism, far from being that thing which, if we somehow reconquer and reclaim and take it over and make it work for us, it will be a vehicle of the Labour Party has not been a vehicle of socialism arguably since the First World War, since 1918. Every one of its governments and administrations has acted against the interests of the people. I know that's hard to hear from people who think, oh, they gave up the NHS, and I'm not going to go into that history. If you want that history, chapter and verse, I really encourage you to get hold of this book, Britain's Perfidious Labour Party. Britain's Perfidious Labour Party. Because actually throughout its history, chapter and verse, it's been a vehicle of anti-communism, a vehicle of repression of workers. They love to say the Thatcherite Tory laws, anti-trade union laws are oppressing us, but every administration they get in doesn't get rid of them, they add to them and they perpetuate them and they tie the hands of the unions, and they actually even tell the union leaders, don't make a fuss, because if you make a fuss, you'll make a scene, we'll go out of government and the hated Tories will come back in, and in this way they perpetuate and extend. So they're absolutely the agents of repression. If you look at that front cover, they're carting away nice upper working class, well off working class retirees, 60-year-old, 70-year-old, an 82-year-old vicar. They're taking away as enemies of the state because they held up a piece of cardboard in Westminster Square protesting a genocide. And that's a Labour Party government, a Labour Party minister signed a piece of paper that prescribed the right of British workers to take direct action. And interestingly, and I'm going to end on this just as a point so you can just contrast this. What did they do? The minute they had prescribed this direct action group who held up pieces of paper to say we don't like mass murder and genocide being committed in our name, they dissolved Parliament. They went to their little photo shoot. They got all the female members of Parliament to wear nice sashes that said WSPI, Women's Suffragette Movement, Women's Social Suffrage Movement. They basically dressed up in the costume of suffragettes and celebrated the great role that the suffragettes have played in winning the vote and democracy for British women. Do you not see an act of cognitive dissonance? 1 minute you ban direct action and arrest an 82-year-old woman for holding up a bit of paper in Parliament Square. You call her a terrorist, take her to jail. We're going to pursue her under that terrorist legislation which denies her a jury trial, which denies her knowing the evidence against her, which she can face up to 14 years in prison for, and then you quietly walk away, put that aside. We've done the business of the ruling class. Let's dress up like direct action people fighting for women's votes and take photos of ourselves and celebrate the role of the great bourgeois democracy in winning our freedom. So we are living, I'm going to end now, we're living in a time of increased repression, and we will see that repression. I'm a surgeon, I'm a person who spent my life dedicated to helping others, to saving others, and genuinely as part of my work, I try and do that every day. Sometimes I fail, but I will try and succeed. And with our politics, with our social action, we should be in a place to extend that, to make that a generalized ethos of society. Why can't we have decent food, clothing, housing, shelter for all human beings, regardless of their age, regardless of their financial status, when in the family into which they happen to be born? It's as much not your fault that you were born a white English Anglo-Saxon Protestant as it is Ellie's fault she wasn't, or my fault that I was born into a family of one income bracket, or yours that you were born into another. We're human beings with a common history, a common and shared ancestry, and we can live together and build a beautiful society. To do that, we have to challenge the real property interests of those who really own society. And I put it to you that Labour Party, far from helping us to do that, is repressing everyone who take a single step down that road. So please join with us, come and see our bookstall, come and see us online, go to our website. We've got branches up and down the country which are growing. These are our aims, and I ask you to join us.
Timed because I think our microphone just broke. Any thoughts or contributions from the floor? Please yell. Yeah, you have to come at the front. I have to give up on that now. Any more? Any more? So, oh, come on then. Come up the front and shout to the audience.
Is it really gone?
Yeah.
That's a bit of a shame.
It's lost its charge. I think they weren't properly charged before. Hold back.
That is a mic, yeah. Just if you hold it, it'll be enough.
Yeah. I'm not being flippant about the most disgusting mass murder that's being viewed live on our TVs and YouTube. You know, Hitler never had that chance. But people are being starved to death, and those who are still alive, rag and bones, they're being tempted to aid centres. They're being tempted to aid centres. People who are absolutely desperate, they just want just something to eat, something to drink. Our comrades, our working class brothers and sisters, and they are being blown to pieces by tank shells. They're being gunned down. They're being murdered in thousands weekly, and our Labour Party supports that. Our Labour Party sanctions and pays for that. What I'd like to know is would it not be more humane to put them in a gas chamber? Would it not be more humane than to starve them, to tempt them into an area where they think they're safe, and to blow them into small pieces, small children being blown to pieces by tank shells? Thank you, sorry.
Very powerful, man. Well done. Well done.
Thank you, comrade. I think with our technical difficulties, okay, no, maybe not. We are surviving. Thank you very much, comrade, that was really powerful. And it's true, I think Ian's expressed a real anger and frustration that so many of us feel, which is exactly, of course, the anger and frustration that has driven the people whose organisation this weekend or last weekend got proscribed, they are being labelled as terrorists for opposing the worst acts of terrorism we have had to stand by and watch and witness. So it's a thoroughly traumatizing experience, not just for those under the direct bombing, but for those of us who have to stand on the side and feel so powerless. And it reminds us of the importance of mobilizing our collective power, because as individuals we are weak, traumatized, powerless individuals in the face of this hideous criminality. But together as a united force, we have all the power necessary to stop it. And that is a message that nobody wants us to get. They want us to think that the best we can achieve is a bit of tokenistic direct action, and then the state will come down on us like a ton of bricks. But it's not the best we can achieve. That's the cry of the frustrated and the traumatized individuals. It's not the response of an organised ruling class, the organised working class. Organised workers have the power to actually stop the war machine entirely. And we have to remember our own history. Our own history is that in 1919 and 1920, the British ruling class was the prime mover in assembling a coalition of 14 countries to attack the new Russian Soviet Republic and try to destroy it. Winston Churchill, I think, was the foreign secretary at the time, and his words were, "We must strangle the Bolshevik baby in its crib." They put all their money and all their power into trying to destroy the new Soviet Russia. And the British working class, led by communists, through the trade union movement and mass organisations of the working class, built a campaign called Hands Off Russia. And that campaign organised workers up and down the country to refuse to cooperate with any aspect of the war machine. It got to the point where the TUC, whose leaders were as cowardly 100 years ago as they are today, they didn't want to do this, but they were forced from the grassroots up. They were forced to threaten a general strike, and the government knew it was real. The government knew that if they didn't change their policy, there was going to be a general strike. And they had to back down, and the working class forced the British working class to back out of that war of intervention in 1920. And not only that, the government was so worried about the fact that the working class had organised itself in what were basically becoming like proto-Soviets, like a new kind of state machinery appearing up and down the country, and workers' control and power over industry and their lives, their communities. They very quickly granted a bunch of social reforms for pensions and unemployment insurance to quieten down the level of class struggle that was becoming very dangerous for them. So let us remember, even if we want to fight for ourselves and our own interests, this type of organisation that we need to stop the war machine, it's the same organisation we need to fight for ourselves. And it comes from ourselves. It's not going to come from a saviour. It's not going to come from Parliament. It's not going to come from petitions. It comes from us organising in our own independent class interests to stop the ruling class in its crimes of austerity at home and its criminal wars abroad. Thanks, comrades.
I guess we come naturally to the end of the meeting. If anyone wants to make any contribution, there's no subject that is taboo. We're great believers in the audience actually speaking their mind and saying what's on their mind, and we should, our discussion, if there's going to be one, should be tailored to your thoughts. So I'm going to just open the mic to the floor if anyone wants to say anything at all. I was a teacher, and it's very important to wait for 7 seconds and to keep on staring at people until they get over their idea of fear and fright. But with a very small group of people, we won't televise or stream anything that you say if you don't want it to be. But do come and say, you know, what are the things that are on your minds? What are your worries and concerns? What do you think the issues that we should be facing? So anyone's free to make any point that they like. But of course, if everyone's totally happy that what needs to have been said has been said, we could wrap it up. So please stay with us, have a conversation with us individually, have a look at the bookstall, bring people around, and we'd love to see you. Thanks all for coming and taking part.